Hi, welcome. Today we are talking to Dr. Julie Ponesse, and I will tell you more about her story as we go, but I want her to tell us her story. So we're just going to have a conversation. We're both philosophy professors, and we're both living through these crazy times. And she has a unique story that I think my audience will appreciate if you don't already know it. So, Julie, can you tell us what happened to you between August of 2021 and today? And what are you doing now? Tell us about your journey.
Sure. Well, it's interesting you say we're both philosophy professors. I mean, I'm not really in some sense anymore, not in the sort of formal vocational employment sense, right? Though I have to say that the work I'm doing now feels much more philosophically rigorous and also more useful in terms of communicating ideas than it's ever been. So just to clarify for everybody, I was terminated from Huron College, which is a college that's part of Western University, which is about 2 hours west of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. And so I was terminated September 16th of this year. And yeah, I mean, if any of your viewers are familiar with the academic world, you know how post the economic collapse in 2008, how incredibly difficult it became for those going on the job market. I went on the job market right in 2008. And so, the number of jobs that were available reduced by about 50%. And so, you know how hard it is to get a job of any kind in academia. And when you're a philosopher, you don't really even have the opportunity to work outside of academia. I mean, there are some options, if you have philosophy of science degree or philosophy of law degree, you might be able to work in those sectors in some respect. But my degrees were in very academic things, in ancient philosophy and ethical theory. And so, being employed in any capacity as a philosophy professor was very, very coveted, and you felt very privileged and very grateful to be doing that work. And I think also there's a sense in which when you're doing the only thing you've ever done that you also love, but it's the only thing you've ever done, it's very hard to imagine another kind of life, right?
Yeah.
But I was forced to imagine another kind of life. And of course, when we face these obstacles in life, sometimes, it's like the compression of the carbon to make diamonds, right? I mean, you can't get that good thing unless you're under pressure that you would never voluntarily choose for yourself.
Right.
So when I got fired, I'd been working with a group on a volunteer basis in Canada called the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. And it's a group of physicians and scientists working to provide evidence-based information, balanced information about COVID as a virus and treatment options, and then the vaccine rollout. So I continued doing that work, and I mean, I had the opportunity then to have more of a media presence. So I'd been doing interviews all along. And then one day, I guess this was in November, early November, maybe end of October, I got a call from the Democracy Fund in Canada, which is either the largest or one of the largest civil liberties organizations in Canada, offering me the position of the pandemic ethics scholar. And the way it was framed was basically a position that would allow me to do what I was doing, except in a more formal capacity with more resources at my disposal. So I took that on, and I've been giving speeches and doing interviews and things in a very public educational way, right? So
Great.
it's been really wonderful. I mean, it's a challenge every day, because every day the target moves and morphs, and we're trying to understand, how did we get here, and what is the what is the what's coming next, how do we
Right.
prepare for that, how do we understand it. But it's certainly a very live challenge, right? It feels like I couldn't be doing anything that's more relevant to what I was trained to do than what I'm doing now. So it sounds cliche, but it's a real blessing in disguise in some sense.
Right. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is because I'm trying to understand where things are going, how we got here. And I thought you would be a great resource for that. And I read your book, and I was hoping you can tell my audience a little bit about your book and what brought you to write it and how you're doing now.
Yeah, it was, it was sort of one of the ideas when I joined the Democracy Fund, one of the ways of communicating to the public my views in a more, I mean, interviews, I don't think I've done one ever that's been 2 hours was probably the longest, and that was
Wow.
rare. Usually they're an hour, sometimes shorter than that. So there's only so much time to get into the argument. And then when someone else is asking you questions, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to kind of fill out or complete your argument and follow its natural trajectory, right? So writing the book was really an opportunity to, I mean, it does two things. It presents my experience with the vaccine mandates at Western from my point of view, right? Which is
Right.
not, it's not a bird's eye view. It's not meant to be a comprehensive view of everybody's, point
Yeah.
of view on the subject. Of course, it can't be. So it's from my perspective, what happened? What did that feel like? What did I do to challenge the mandates? That kind of thing. And then secondly, it gives a sort of an ethical case. The central chapter, chapter 4, gives really the ethical case against the mandates per se, right? So if
Right.
anybody's curious about, is this an argument against vaccines in general, or against the COVID vaccines, or against the mandates, my primary target is against mandating this investigational set of products for people, and therefore undermining informed consent. That's my main
Right.
concern, right? There are lots and lots of issues with the pandemic situation, right? So there's mental health issues to do with lockdowns, and there are issues with the vaccine passports. I mean, it's so many things, but we had to make a decision about timeliness, right? And timeliness versus comprehensiveness in some
Yeah.
sense. And the book is short. We're coming out with a second printing now that will be a little bit larger to read with larger font, but the book that came out in the initial printing is about 90 pages long. It's short. And that was intentional so that it could be published quickly. And so I hope that central chapter, I mean, there are a lot of references there, and I hope that will give people a place to go in order to understand some of the scientific, some of the data that underlines my concerns about the mandates, for example, and then they can use that to engage in conversation with family or friends, or otherwise, if you're writing a letter to your employer or something. And then the book also, the last two chapters are really much less, scientific or medical, properly speaking, and they're more psychological, political, sociological, trying to understand. Would that be a fair characterization, do you think? That
I think so. Yeah.
we're trying to understand, how did we get here as a species? There are a lot of respects in which I think we're repeating mistakes from the past. So why are we doing that? And how did
Yes.
we get to the place where we do that? And if things are as bad as they seem to be, and we've been working at this for 17 months or whatever it's been, how do we as individuals, who are very much in the minority, find a way to work ourselves out of this collectively? So that's sort of a long summary, I guess, of the book.
I love it. I think your book is a great example of public philosophy because you're engaging in matters that affect all of us, and you're doing it philosophically. You provide arguments, and so a person, maybe they don't agree with you, but they can engage in the arguments and give a counter argument. And I think that's not something we're seeing very much of right now, and it's disturbing. And on my podcast, I talk a lot about reason. My emphasis is epistemology and looking at what philosophers think reason is, and distinguishing between what is reason and what is not reason. And you had a really great quote at the end of chapter 5 from Immanuel Kant, where he says that the public use of one's reason must be free at all times, and this alone can bring enlightenment to mankind. And I've read this before, and I appreciate it, but can you say more about the significance of this quote? Why did you include it in your book? And what do you think about the public sense of reason right now?
Yeah, so that's a really good set of questions. First so you might have to remind me of the second one after I do the first
Okay,
one.
that's fine. Yes.
So the first one is about Immanuel Kant. And if any of your viewers are familiar with or have heard about Kant, they're probably a bit squeamish, like, oh dear, she's talking about Kant. I can't handle this book, and you're quite right. You're quite right to be worried about that, because most of what Kant wrote is so intractable even to philosophers who specialize in his area, and it's really not very accessible for the average person. But there are some things he wrote that are much more accessible. And Kant, for those who don't know, is an Enlightenment philosopher, 18th century German Enlightenment philosopher. He wrote about all kinds of things, epistemology, so knowledge and metaphysics, and but he also, I think, was a very insightful um, philosopher of citizenry, and a philosopher of society. And he, really made the case for, I think I say in the book, for humanity to grow up. And
Yes.
his take on the Enlightenment, it wasn't just purely intellectual, it was a plea for us to sort of complete our maturation as a human species. Remember, this is in the 18th century. So we've had a few hundred years to get it right, even beyond that. And I think what he said is as applicable now as it was then, if not more so. And he wrote an essay called "What is Enlightenment?" And enlightenment is, we think about the Enlightenment age. It's very literal, right? It's the idea is that you're coming into the light, and you're maybe seeing things that you or we as a society didn't see before that, and the emergence of reason and embracing our capacities as individuals to reason. And he says in this essay, it was 1784, I think, that enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. I mean, that's a dig, Kant. Like,
Wow.
that's, our self-imposed immaturity. And he goes on to say that immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. And it's really interesting because the word compliance, which in the book I call what we're going through, we don't just have this viral pandemic situation to deal with, but in my view, we're going through a pandemic of coercion and compliance. And one of the sort of the root concepts of the word compliance is that you are submitting to the will of another. You're
Ooh.
taking on the reasoning of another person. And Kant, right, is calling that kind of the pinnacle of immaturity. And so he says the problem here is not that we lack understanding, but that we lack courage and resolve to think for ourselves.
Wow.
Use
That's
our own
powerful.
identity. Isn't that powerful?
Very powerful. Yeah. So,
Yeah. So it's
so
not so much that we're reasoning badly now. It's not so much, right, that I think it's not so much that we have this stalemate debate between the pro and the anti-narrative people, and that we could just say, oh, to the other side, well, if only you saw this bit of evidence, if only you corrected this error in reasoning, we would get to the same place. Because it's not really that one or both sides are reasoning badly. It's that we aren't reasoning at all. It's that we've given up the project of thinking that it's our job as citizens, not let alone like individual human beings, but we've given up this idea that we have a responsibility as citizens of a democratic state to use our minds to the best of our abilities and to try to think independently from what our government is telling to do, from what the mobs are telling us to do. We've just forgotten that we have a job in addition to what our 9 to 5 job is, in addition to for our parents or whatever we are.
wow, this is so interesting. I'm going to tell you a funny story. A friend and I, he's a writer and I try to write. We thought we were having writer's block during the pandemic because it's almost like I can't get my ideas out. Then we realized, no, we have audience block. We have ideas, but we don't know who's going to listen or how they're going to respond, and it's almost like we've lost the ability to communicate with each other about the things that are happening to us. And I was wondering, has the public lost its reason? Have individuals lost their reason?
I
And
think we've
yeah,
lost our willingness to work. for
Ooh,
it, meant to do the mental work, I think.
wow.
You
That's
know, and
scary.
it's really scary, but I think we've taken on as a virtue, you know, in the book, there's this section at the end on civic virtues, right? So the
Yes.
virtues are the kind of the moral, you know, the character traits that make us good citizens, that help us to flourish in a state. And I think we've taken on as a civic virtue the idea that a good citizen is one who outsources his or her thinking to the state,
Wow, that's scary.
right?
Okay, this leads to my next question. I don't know if you've read the book by Rod Dreher,
I've
Live
heard
Not.
about it.
Well, I had a group discussion on my YouTube channel, and so I refer back to it because some of my listeners have read it too. So I thought I was going to tie it together with some things we've talked about before. And in his book, Live Not by Lies, it was published over a year ago. He's sort of warning of this coming of soft totalitarianism, where we have like a totalitarianism, but it isn't. Um, it isn't violent, or there's nothing that's forcing it, enforcing
Yes.
it, but the system, I guess. And so at the time, I thought, this is crazy. This is just too much to take in. But now I'm wondering, are we seeing soft totalitarianism today through these mandates?
Yeah, what's really interesting about that, so you said the book came out about a year ago, is
Yeah.
that right? So if it was published about a year ago, he had the initial ideas for this book
Yes, he
much
did. And he saw
before that.
the social credit system in China and he was making applications like that could come here. And I was like, no. And now maybe.
Yeah, lots of things to say about that. I mean, on that topic, you know, looking to China, what's happened in China, I have found just by coincidence, but then understanding the significance of this later, that so many people who are challenging the mandates and who did it early on, you know, months and months ago, and who were worried about what was going on politically in Canada and I think elsewhere in the world, so many of them have backgrounds in very, how can I put it in general terms, you know, very, very controlling governments, and where they've
Yes.
suffered, you know, at
Yes.
the abuses of governments and totalitarian states of various kinds. And so, for example, I mean, I have a number of colleagues in an academic group I belong to, or who are all, you know, they hail from Eastern Europe or the Soviet, and a number of physicians in Canada, interestingly, who are speaking out in the medical context are from South Africa,
Oh,
right?
wow.
With a history of apartheid. So
Yeah.
I think it's not a coincidence, right? That I think these are people who come from, and recently enough, from places where they know what's possible, how citizens can suffer at the hands of their government. And that's so much at odds with something that I frequently see in the comments section of my YouTube videos or on social media, who are challenging me. And one comment I see a lot is people who say, you know, what's she talking about? Everyone knows governments only have our best interests at heart. Everyone knows they're doing their best and they care for us. And I think, so interestingly, this kind of overgeneralization that everyone knows, I think, do we? This is quite news to me, you know.
Yeah.
And secondly, I would challenge this person or this set of people or this idea to try to point to some historical examples that are settled enough to show us that governments have this kind of altruistic motivation or power. And that's not to
Wow.
say that they're all, you know, pure evil or something, but I think we need to be
Right.
careful in our assumption that in virtue of being elected to a government position, that person is somehow morally superior to the average person, right? But
Right.
on the topic of whether we're in this soft totalitarianism state, um, I mean, as a philosopher, you'll appreciate this, probably always so good to get clear about our terms and what we mean by them,
Yes.
right? And so totalitarianism I take to be a kind of authoritarianism, right? A form
Yeah.
of authority that becomes institutionalized to the degree that challenge to that authority is no longer, it's not just not valued, but it's no longer possible, right? Because if you
Yes.
do try to challenge that authority, you will either be silenced or punished or extinguished in some way, right?
Right.
So totalitarianism is this form of government where all functional aspects of the state become centralized and homogenized, and all opposition. So opposition parties are prohibited. We've seen that historically in the past, and individual opposition to the state is outlawed. And there's just this high degree of control exercised over citizens, not only our movement and activities in the public sphere, but also in our private lives as well, right?
Yeah.
So if by soft totalitarianism we mean, some approximation of that, but not quite that, well, I think that it's an easy argument to make to show that in Canada, at least, we are definitely in a soft totalitarian state, because we cannot. I think the question is, what is the thickness of that totalitarianism? I don't know if it's soft or medium or semi-firm or
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes.
But we definitely. It's not possible. And I know this from speaking with journalists in Canada. There are certain articles they simply cannot publish. You
Wow.
cannot, for example, in Canada, publish an article which tells a story of vaccine injury.
Wow.
The journalists will be fired if this happens, and they've been told by their editors that that's just not acceptable. You cannot, as a physician, challenge your governing body, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, for example. You cannot write prescriptions for some of the known very effective treatments for COVID that have not necessarily been approved by Health Canada or the FDA in the States. And so there's definitely a kind of authoritarianism within
Right.
those particular contexts. I, as an academic, could not successfully challenge the mandates of my university. And by that, I don't just mean that I didn't have success changing them or making accommodation for myself, but I didn't have success creating dialogue about that
Right.
in an
Right.
academic community,
This
right?
is very worrisome. And I think as students of philosophy, at least for me, I started this journey because I wanted truth. I wanted truth more than anything else. And I think that's what's so troubling right now, is that the process of looking for truth is being stunted. It's almost like I can't even ask the questions that I would normally ask to try to arrive at the truth.
Well, question asking comes with stigma now, right? You
Yeah.
are stigmatized because questioning puts you in a position of challenging that authority we were just talking
Right.
about.
Right.
And you don't ask questions if you're in complete compliance. So the
Mm.
mere asking of a question puts you in a stance of opposition and challenge. And if you're opposing the orthodoxy, then you are a heretic. You are blasphemous. And
So,
how have we dealt with those in the past?
right. So by nature, our jobs put us in the place of Socrates,
Yeah.
right?
And that also means, the fact that most philosophers in Canada and the States and the Western world have kept their jobs, in my view, means they're not doing them.
Yeah. Yes.
That's
So,
harsh, I guess, but
yeah. So we'll see what happens with this video. All right. So
you can blame it all on me.
I won't actually. I asked you on, and for a reason. And part of that reason is connected to the next question I have for you. So for those of us who are concerned about the future of our countries, about the globe, the world is going into a very dark place right now. What advice do you have for us moving forward, particularly those who are doing kind of intellectual work? We're all citizens, but there are people who do have the opportunity to speak out at this moment.
I'm going to ask your audience to participate in a little thought experiment for a moment, right? So thought experiment is trying to imagine that the world is other than it is, right? It's in some way. So imagine for a minute that everyone who had doubts about what's going on and everyone who wished they could challenge the narrative, but just don't, spoke out and resisted. This would be over like that.
Yeah.
So, and we don't do it I think I have felt all the things that people feel when they decide not to do it. So I think I can probably speak as a competent judge to this, that
Yes.
we're afraid. We're afraid of losing our jobs. And there are many people, I think, who have more on the line economically than I did. But we're afraid of losing our jobs. We're afraid of not being able to keep our homes and put food on the table and function in society. Perhaps more than that, we're afraid of social ostracization. We know that the human mind processes fear of being separated from our social group in much the same way that we process physical, fears of physical pain,
Yes.
right? So there's a great amount of fear. But another story that I hear a lot from people is that we feel that if we just give an inch, that'll do it, and this will all be over. I hear that a lot, oh, if I just do the 2 jabs and then it'll be done. I'll just do this. I'll just do this. And, as a philosopher, you'll know that while we like to call slippery slope arguments a fallacy, they aren't always, if you can establish the right
Yes.
connections, right, between the various
Right.
steps. And I think that thinking that complying or giving in, making little concessions to things that we don't necessarily agree with will somehow buy our freedom, will somehow get ourselves out of this, is the kind of slippery slope that's non-fallacious in my view, right? It's the kind of slippery slope that's going to get us in a position that we would not have chosen just by choosing a number of little steps that lead up to it, right?
Right.
People are asking me this a lot lately, so I put a lot of thought into what can we do as individual people, as individual citizens. And I think one thing we have to think about is, how will we use our money? How will we use our buying power? How will we use our position as economic agents in society to express our voice and our ideas? And we can do very tiny things, like we can switch the coffee shop we go to one that doesn't support a mandate. And I come up with that example because I've done that. So a coffee shop that is that I didn't always go to, just because I used to frequent a number of them, I go to much more now because they have decided not to support the mandate system, right? And so I want to choose to give my money to that kind of business that challenges this narrative, and not to another kind. Um, I think also, speaking a little bit more democratically or politically, I think we have to realize that as democratic citizens, we have responsibilities to the process of democracy and not just the outcome. So to be a good democratic citizen and communicate with one another is not just to hurl our opinions back and forth across the
Yeah.
internet, right? But to do the hard work of coming together and creating a respectful space where we listen to other people. And that doesn't mean just waiting to pounce on them, right? I say this in the book. It doesn't mean just like listening, going, la, 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 when are you done? So I can say my thing, right? But actually approaching a person with the stance of thinking we might have something to learn. And if you're about to talk to someone and you don't get that impression from them, or you don't, or they demonstrate to you that they're not willing to offer that to you in return, there's no point.
Yeah.
Don't waste your energy.
Agree.
And I think you will find there are very few people actually who are capable of that kind of open, respectful, generous exchange of ideas. But I think we need to work on those and expand them and strengthen. It's like a muscle, right? You've got to
Right.
keep it and exercise it and practice it, and then it will grow and it will strengthen, and it will develop.
I agree with you. And that's part of what we're trying to do with this YouTube channel. I'm
Yes.
trying to build an intellectual community, not just to do, oh, let's just talk about ideas, but to actually do good work in the world around us and to have fruitful conversations. And some of the things we've been talking about is common ground and finding common ground and how to do that. And when we don't have common ground, then it's okay to walk away from a conversation. And it may be just at that time, maybe later you do have common ground. But I do think we need to continue having these conversations, and we need to be courageous. We need to exercise our reason, and freedom isn't just guaranteed. It can go away very quickly. And
We didn't know this, right?
we
I mean, in
didn't
virtue
know
of being the
this.
age that we are, we've never really lived through a time when our freedoms were threatened in this way.
No.
But our grandparents probably did in some way, or or the parents of people we know probably did in some way. And on the topic of finding common ground, I think this is really important because, we don't have to agree about everything to get along, right? You and I there are probably lots of things we disagree about, but when it comes to this, this mandate situation or this COVID situation, I think that conversations often break down when the two sides realize that they say disagree about whether a mandate should be imposed. And it's unfortunate because we might realize that actually we share the common value of wanting to protect the health and mental well-being of people, but we just disagree about how to best do that. And if we
Yes.
understood what we agree about and what we disagree about, we would probably take the conversation less personally, and um, be we would be able to recognize the value of the other person more, because we say, well, there's still a person who cares about humans. Okay, I can
Yeah.
talk to you, but if we disagree about mandates, okay, well, why is that? We can talk about that. I can understand why you wouldn't want to have a conversation with someone who thinks that small, children should be slaughtered and sold to the highest bidder or something, fine. But most people don't believe that.
Right.
Where we disagree is about how you achieve that end, right?
Yes.
Or what can be sacrificed to achieve that end, or something like that. And so
Right.
I think those the mechanisms, the instruments that get us those values, if we talk about those things, it's much less personal and much less volatile, right?
I agree with you. I agree with you. And it seems like, okay, here's where I sometimes have a disconnect. The people around me, let's say my colleagues, I know we have different views and we don't talk about it, but we can
Yeah.
talk about a lot of other things, even though we disagree. I know my colleagues and I disagree on pretty much everything, but we do talk about them, and we are people. I
Yeah.
don't understand why we can't do the same thing with this topic. Why is it so personal, or why are people so invested in it?
It's very taboo, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
my own feeling is that part of the component here is that we're very quick to label, and label others you and puts you on the outs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So this is how it is in Canada, and I suspect it's similar in the States. But I mean, it doesn't take much to get you on the anti-vaxxer list.
Yeah.
I've lived there for quite
Yeah.
a while, but it doesn't take very much. I mean, if someone says, "Oh, can you look at the Pfizer 6 months results?
Yeah.
6 month results came out a little while ago, and they're very concerning." And so someone who might have been, someone who might have gotten 2 doses of the vaccine and had been on board with it could quite reasonably look at those results and say, "Oh, gee, okay, I want to go to my doctor and let's have a little chat about this with a 300% increase in adverse." Very concerning. But if you do that these days, or if you want to talk to one of your colleagues about this, oh, she's just an anti-vaxxer. What do we do with anti-vaxxers? We put them in the corner out in the cold, tie them like a dog with a chain to the tree, and we don't talk to them anymore. We discipline them when they act up.
Yeah. This is so
Yeah.
strange to me, because in every other respect, um, I think people could look at my life, at least, and see, okay, I'm responsible. I've been responsible for the 2 years, but to just put a person in that box, I guess it's maybe not using reason again. There's something else driving it, fear, maybe, like you mentioned, fear driving it.
And it makes you inhuman, I think, when you put these
Yeah.
labels on people. I mean, especially anti-vaxxer being grammatically incorrect. Well, don't you think that part of the purpose of making that term grammatically incorrect is to dehumanize the person to whom you apply it?
Oh, that is so interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
Well, we don't call, I mean, I guess we do use the term vaccine hesitant, but the term that really I think people are afraid of having applied to them is anti-vaxxer. And if we
Yeah.
were satisfied with the term vaccine hesitant, and I don't even like that, I prefer something more like vaccine inquisitive or vaccine
Yes.
comprehensive or vaccine open or something like that,
I
but
was vaccine wait and see. And now it's like other things have happened that have made me go, you know what? I'm not even sure.
vaccine nonsensical or something.
Yes.
But I think we do have this fear of just getting shut down and put out and othered
Yeah.
and dehumanized. So when you discuss and I've worked in ethics and medical ethics for a number of years, and so the topics there are hot, right?
Yes.
And I agree with you that I've always been able to talk with colleagues about them, whatever they are, even the most sensitive of them, but not about this. And I think now I don't know why this is ultimately, but all of those other positions don't humanize you for holding them, but this
Yeah.
does. Now, why that is very, very strange. I think it's a bit like, we have this metaphor. So that, the contagion of a physical virus has created this metaphor for the contagion of ideas, and we perceive those, right, to be as dangerous, if not more so, than a physical threat to our person, right?
That's powerful. Yeah.
Mm.
So it's not just about our health, it's about ideas and
It's about the kind
mysterious.
of people we want in society. It's about the kind of people with the sort of ideas and minds we want teaching our children. And isn't it about the kinds of people we want reproducing?
Yes. Yes. This is a lot to think about.
You're going to have nightmares tonight.
Well, that's not unusual. Yeah. So, okay, we need to find a way to give people hope at the end of this conversation. I like to wrap things up with a hopeful perspective. I think, okay, here's my little bit of hope. The pandemic has changed a lot. When I started when I started public philosophy, it was local. It was at my college and a couple other colleges. With the technology that we've been forced to learn, I can now talk to you. You're in Canada and I'm in Phoenix, and we're having this conversation. So my hope is that there are other people like you and like me out there that we can converse with that we wouldn't have connected to previously. And because we are interested in ideas, and this happens to be the most pressing one in our lives right now, perhaps we can broaden our conversation a bit more. I really enjoyed the part of your book where you were talking about the Greek gang and having talking about ideas in this passionate way that we did when we first started philosophy. I had a similar experience. And I think that that's still a possibility. It may not be with our college roommates, but it may be in a different way. And we can preserve the intellectual life that way.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm just thinking, and I'm going to try out a pretty controversial idea with you and your viewers, but it's the idea that in some sense, we might take this COVID test. In the book, I talk about a COVID test, and I don't by that mean the PCR test or anything like that, but that it's really tested who we are as people and what we believe and what our relationships are made of. And I think whenever that happens, we get surprising results, and some of the results are not what we want. Some of our deepest relationships are not as strong as we want. We're disappointed in people a lot. We've disappointed people probably. But one thing that can also come out of that, is being grateful for the good surprises and grateful for the relationships that have been built. I have tens, if not over 100, probably new relationships with people in sectors that I never would have encountered before. Scientists and physicians and academics at other institutions, and most recently today, the premier of Newfoundland. And it's just the people that you speak with are that you connect with. And by that, I don't mean that, oh, finally, I found all the people with the right answers or the truth. It's not that. It's that they're willing to get on the boat with you and exchange ideas without being in a position of defensiveness and offensiveness, of being on the attack all the time, And I know, reflecting on my own life, that I know which relationships have fallen apart, and I can see the seeds of the problems pre-pandemic that were just brought to light by this social situation. But also I think about, and I'm incredibly grateful for, the relationships I had prior that have just grown and strengthened, and showed themselves to be more than I thought they were. So we can grieve the loss of what we've lost, I think, while also being grateful for the phoenix that has emerged from these ashes,
I think that's a great place to finish our conversation for now. And I would like to encourage my audience to go out and find Dr. Julie Ponesse's book, My Choice, and I will put a link to it in the comments below. Thank you again for joining us, Julie, and thank you all for being in this conversation with us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.